All right. Hello and welcome to the first installment of Poems by People, a poetry podcast where we will take a deep look into some of our favorite poets and we'll try to capture their style, Garrett. I'm sure we will.
Yeah, so today we're going to be taking a look at Emily Dickinson and James Wright, two poets that Justin and I both found ourselves vastly entertained and intrigued by. And we're going to basically go over their styles, give some biographical information, really get into what makes them them.
Yeah.
And then we're going to read some poems that we've prepared for each other and capture reactions.
Yeah. It's going to be a great time and we'll hope you stick around to the end. So I think we'll lead off. Garrett, would you like to lead off or would you like me to?
Yeah, sure, I can
Awesome.
go. So the poet that I decided to talk about today, I did my research on, was Emily Dickinson. And Emily Dickinson is a poet that I really fell in love with because of how almost enigmatic her writing is. It's something you look at and you're like so confused by at first, and then you work with it and the work works with you.
Yeah.
Until you develop this understanding, and I think through that process you get this really individual understanding with her work that you don't get with some other poets who are more
Where did your
clear-cut.
interest with her work start, Garrett?
Actually, kind of randomly, I was at a book exchange and I stumbled upon some Victorian literature. I love that. I talk about that all the time.
Yeah.
And I found this just poetry book by Emily Dickinson about her nature poetry. And I was like, okay, I'll buy it. It was a book exchange. It was free because I cashed in a couple books. And every day, with you actually.
Yeah, of course.
We've been reading a couple poems, just trying to figure it out on our own.
Yeah, it's been really beautiful. I really enjoyed the time that we spent reading those poems. But I'm excited to learn a little bit more about Emily Dickinson, if you will.
Yeah.
Please continue.
So Emily Dickinson was born in Amherst and died in Amherst.
Very nearby. I know a few people from Amherst.
Yeah, she was a recluse. She was pretty notoriously reclusive. As a kid, she grew up, she would go out, she went to school, she had friends, but then as she got older, she became more and more homebodied.
Yeah.
And, she's still open to seeing friends and family.
Of course.
But she really kind of stuffed herself in the home, and no one knows exactly why. Some people speculate that it was, a medical condition.
Yeah.
Very well could be. Some people say that it was just her disposition to spend time alone. But it's really interesting because similarly, shout out Victorian literature, but similarly to the Bronte sisters, who also lived a reclusive life, she was able to write these powerful, emotional and evocative works, which, if you understood that she lived in her home her whole life, you'd be like, how does she have this so in-depth understanding
You're right.
of the world?
I understand her as a poet a lot of the time that wrote a lot about nature, which is honestly a little bit of a contrast from what you say about her living life of as a recluse and not seeing the sunlight a whole ton. So it's very interesting to me. It's definitely something I haven't really heard of before, and was not previously established in my knowledge of Dickinson's work.
Yeah, so she began writing when she was young. She always wrote, but most of her works actually weren't published under her name. So she submitted some anonymous works, but most of them came out post-mortem after she died.
Really?
Yeah,
I didn't know that at all.
Which is interesting because she never got to see the fame, because she's one of the most critically acclaimed poets
Was
of
she
her time.
was she critically acclaimed when she was alive at all?
No, people didn't know she wrote poems.
Really? She
Yeah.
just did it as a side gig. This was just purely an interest
It
and
was
a
a for
hobby.
funsy kind of thing.
That's so interesting to me because I find her work so evocative and I find it speaking to me a lot of the time, and yet she wasn't even alive to be
No, people didn't know how great of a poet she was when she was alive. She published anonymous works, and then she died, and her whole list of journals of poems got spread out because she died, and it was made to be published.
were her poems that were published after her death recognized as her works, or were they still anonymous, a lot of them?
So I'm not sure about immediately at this point, and I'd make the assumption that when they were released, they were under her name because she was dead and had no qualms about that. I'm not really sure though.
Yeah.
But so her father was actually very involved in Amherst. He began as a lawyer.
Yeah.
He went to Amherst College and then he went to Harvard. And he was super involved with the community. He was the treasurer of Amherst. He He was a supporter of Amherst Academy, secretary to the Fire Academy, and he was chairman of the annual cattle show. So he was a person that was not a recluse.
Makes me wonder why she spent so much time at home, you know?
Yeah.
It's very confusing, it's very surprising.
Yeah, and no one really knows the answer to that. But so what she wrote about was what she knew, which was nature, religion, law, music. She wrote a lot of beautiful stuff about nature, and that's kind of what I focused on in my research.
I'm a big fan of poetry that has like a distinct ability to like bring out the beauty of nature behind like the visual aspect of it. Being able to describe nature in a poetic way is something that is like far like beyond imaginable. What is just meets the eye. There's so much beauty in the words that can just draw out the beauty in the nature.
Yeah,
beyond one's eyes.
I completely agree, Justin. Yeah. I think there's something about trying to describe the vastness of nature in such a concise form.
Yeah.
Even epic poems like are so concise to be describing like all that nature has to do it. But Emily Dickinson, in her notorious short poems, like is able to capture this like really amazing beauty and like almost sentimental meaning. By relating it to natural things and like physical concrete ideas. So yeah, Emily Dickinson, she wrote about nature, religion, law, and music, and her poems are, for the most part, described as lyrics, although she did a lot of stuff. She played around and experimented with some things, but mostly she wrote lyric type poems.
What do you mean by lyric type? Do you mean like as in like they could be used like in a song or musical format, or are we just using like lyric type to do like they're from the perspective of somebody, like somebody's like saying these words?
Yeah, so lyric as a form is generally associated with this like melodic, I don't want to say bouncy, but almost song-like melody that you can hear in the poem, and there is like all the metrical like reasons why, but it's something that you can hear, like Humpty Dumpty sat on the wall. And now might be a good time to read this poem.
I can't wait.
I really it's called "Split the Lark and You'll Find the Music."
Got those music influences in there.
Exactly. So the poem goes, "Split the lark and you'll find the music. Bulb after bulb in silver rolled, scantily dealt to the summer morning. Saved for your ear when lutes be old. Loose the flood, you shall find it patent. Gush after gush, reserved for you. Scarlet experiment, skeptic Thomas. Now do you doubt that your bird was true?"
Wow. Very, very concise. Very, very concise. It's very short.
You see what I mean about the kind of musical element to that?
Yeah. Maybe we should actually read that one more time. Do you mind?
No, of course. And that's what I think you have to do with Dickinson's work and poetry. Honestly,
in general.
But it's really like the second reading, I think you find so much more.
Of course. Let's read it again.
Split the lark and you'll find the music. Bulb after bulb in silver rolled. Scantily dealt to the summer morning, saved for your ear when lutes be old. Loose the flood, you shall find it patent. Gush after gush, reserved for you. Scarlet experiment, skeptic Thomas. Now do you doubt that your bird was true?
That was very, very good. I can definitely see what you mean by it's like speaking for itself. It's got its melodic form. It's every first half of the line meets every second half of the line in perfect harmony. It really does like feel like it's churning through in a rhythmic, melodic way.
Well said. What do you make of this poem, Justin?
Well, you know what? It's kind of hard to like when we're talking about semantics, of course, and, like the meaning of the poem. It's really hard to say. I know we talked about this poem a little bit before, and it really seems like it is saying something like about like it's talking about beauty in some way. I don't really remember exactly what we were talking about with it earlier, but it definitely does seem like it's having a tough time coming to a conclusion. Because the last line of it is a question. It's like, obviously, now do you doubt this? So, like, going back to the beginning, it's like, asking a question, like, now, like, go back to the beginning. Like, do you think, like, that's the way it's supposed to be?
Right.
But I have a tough time, like, deciphering exactly what it is, like, she's talking about.
So my understanding of this poem, which is nuanced, of course, which might not be completely correct, but, poetry is what you make of it, is that the speaker sees this lark, which is a songbird, a beautiful bird, and he sees it singing. And that first stanza is just full of this vivid imagery that's so beautiful. and almost makes you longing to like actually be able to see that, and so he's admiring that beauty in the first stanza.
Yeah.
And then later, the speaker moves on to say, almost like, "Why are you beautiful? Let's find out." And then cuts open the bird and dissects it and kills it. And then the question in the end is, do you understand why it's beautiful now?
So they just tarnish the beauty of the bird just to find out, like, what makes it beautiful? Or, like, is it the idea that, like, maybe, like, just in trying to find out how beautiful it is, like, you destroy the beauty in its perfect essence, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's what we do a lot of the times. If you think about how we criticize art, literature, is we take something we know is beautiful, on its face to be beautiful, and then dig into it, and we dissect it and try to find out what exactly makes it beautiful. And I think the question this poem asks, which isn't answered, is, are things innately beautiful, or are we finding the beauty within them by dissecting them?
That's a great question. Honestly, I mean, we can get a little philosophical here while we have the time. And I'm sure the audience would love to decipher their own meaning of the poem. So please, don't be afraid to DM us with your answers. We would really appreciate it. And so I think personally, like I think we can relate this to something like I find great meaning in its music. A lot of the time this is like a melodic style poem. It's got some rhythmic elements to it that are concise and they're consistent. So I really do believe that just in music is broken down into music theory, and it's really broken down into ways that we understand them. Like language almost, it can be broken down into its key, sounds and everything, and
grammar and prose.
Grammar and prose and poetry just being the outlier. So I think when we take it back to this, it's really hard to gather the best understanding of what it's talking about, because it really is both of them. We find beauty in things by digging into them and understanding them. We find beauty in understanding things that we don't already understand, but we also find beauty in just the observation of things. We don't look outside at a tree and automatically think that it's beautiful, that tree is performing photosynthesis right now, and it's making these gorgeous leaves that are reflecting green
and chlorophyll
and pigmentation. What we think about is, that a tree is gorgeous, the color is amazing, the wind is sending the branches cascading around, letting the light refract through the small holes in the tree branches and the leaves. So, the beauty is in the eye of the beholder. It's not everything in the world is meant to be dissected and torn apart to find that beauty, but it's not to say that isn't a way to do it.
I really like that.
Yeah, but that poem is absolutely gorgeous, and I love the way that you described it, because when she says loose the flood, honestly, when I read that the first time, I'm like, what is she talking about? But she's talking about open up the floodgates, let it all out, let all that beauty out, what's going on inside, and you shall find it patent. And I find that line very beautiful, and it's gush after gush, that's what you're trying to find. It's reserved for you. You're trying to find it, and just to know that it's it almost feels like a mad scientist experiment where you're trying to find the beauty in something, but you just end up destroying it in the end.
Right, and that's so sad, because I think sometimes when we do take that step further into what we want to understand, sometimes we're losing a part of that. We're losing a part of the beauty by understanding it, because with our innate desire to be understanding and learning and growing, which is great, also comes this very critical understanding and critical lens that we take about things, which I think almost takes us out of the present sometimes.
You're absolutely right, and that's the conundrum of the situation. It's quite a catch-22, because you want to be able to be analytical and understand these poems for their scansion and their background history, what's going on in the world, what's the context. But sometimes the beauty is in the words. But at the same time, I feel there's a lot of beauty in understanding that meter relates to a form of maybe when we were learning about it a little bit earlier in poetry classes here, we were learning about how scansion related to if something was in harmony with the world.
Yeah, iambic pentameter, right?
And so it just makes me think, like, even stuff like that, is that being over analytical? Like, maybe it doesn't even require that sometimes, is that tearing the poem apart, just going line by line and understanding the meter of everything?
Yeah, and I think the ironic part right now is that we are analyzing beauty in the sense that we're just talking about how, like, analyzing it sometimes destroys it, and are we destroying that beauty? Are we thinking about it too much? Are we supposed to just take this poem on its face as what it is? I think we should ask the question to ourselves, like, are we even splitting the lark with this poem? Are we cutting it open and dissecting it too much? And you know what, I don't know, because there is a lot of beauty to be found, but there's also just innately, I think, a lot of beauty to be had.
I agree. Couldn't agree more with you. It's definitely a complicated thing, because it could go either way, and I think that's just how it's supposed to be. Because people with different ideas and different mindsets will take things just going different ways. Like, nobody's always going to have, especially in poetry, something that's so interpretive, something that's so reliant on the observer, on the reader. Because if it was just relying on the poet, it would be kind of ridiculous. But it's so reliant on the person who's reading the poem for its meaning, that it has to be just based off of that. But it's up to the reader if they want to analyze it in one way or another. Anyway, so just to go back into what I'm talking about, is James Wright. He's one of my favorite poets. He's well regarded as one of the finest American contemporary poets.
Okay.
He was born on December 13th, just to cover a little biographical information. Born December 13th, 13 days away from myself, in 1927 in Martins Ferry, Ohio. And he unfortunately died at 52 from lung cancer on March 25th in 1980.
Okay.
Neither of his parents were more educated than 8th grade.
Really?
Very interesting, He's such an accomplished poet. He didn't really come from people that were well educated, which obviously isn't always necessary, but is always
But a lot of the
interesting.
time you see that connection with, like, higher education.
Yeah,
and,
because
like, literary studies.
Yeah, because even though neither of his parents were that educated, he attended a very nice liberal arts college in Kenyon College, which is where my brother attended.
He was smart.
He was pretty smart.
Right.
He attended college, and apparently he took a little bit longer to finish high school as well. I know that he had a little struggle with mental health in high school, which led to, like, a panic attack, him dropping out for a little bit and coming back. But regardless, he did end up at Kenyon College, which is known for its literary studies, and I'm aware of that. His poetry often deals with point of view of, like, the American outsider, like somebody that wasn't, at the epicenter of, like, the American dream, somebody that was, like, always, like, living on the outside of metropolitan America, in my
So he was
opinion.
very othered.
Yeah, I feel like he was definitely regarded as an outsider, and
Okay.
his poetry really does reflect that. I feel like a lot of his poetry feels a lot very desolate, and it feels like it's like there's a lot to be desired. There's a lot that is.
Is it lonesome?
It really does feel lonesome. I think that's a great way of describing it. I feel like he was a very lonely person. And on to the next point, he suffered from depression, anxiety, battled alcoholism, and like I said before, he had a very good cigarette addiction. I really feel like a lot of his work was, like, evident and, like, understanding, like, that he it was, like, a way for him to cope. I really like probably his poetry was a good way to cope, because, like, even you and I know we've talked about, like, going through the semester, and sometimes like just, like, a good way to get some catharsis, a good way to get things out is really to write it down. And even writing the poems that we wrote for today, like, was just, like, a really nice feeling inside of me, very vindicating. He's well known for his depictions of the landscapes that make up the American Midwest, which aren't always the most...
Like prairie?
Yeah, which aren't always the most idyllic, but I'll be completely honest to you, like, that is something that I actually find, like, a picturesque, ideal, like, landscape in my mind is just, like, it doesn't need to be, like, well, like, nourished grass. It's just, grass and rolling hills and just, like, up and downs, and just it's
I'm picturing, like, rolling fields of wheat and, like, some sparse woods, but there's like tan colors.
Yeah, the American Midwest is definitely, but it also is definitely a place that exemplifies that. Excuse me, that depression, and, like, I really feel like it was it inspired that kind of outsider feel as well. And lastly, he was a Pulitzer Prize winner for his poetry.
Oh, amazing.
Analytically. Throughout Wright's work, many scholars find it very difficult to find a common center of inspiration between his works or like a unifying technique because of how
Is he all over the place?
he really is all over the place.
Okay.
But I find it more in a way to describe it as a music artist like the Beatles. Like they like started as like a rock and roll group. They were straight roots rock, Brit pop kind of deal. But their genre changed over time in a gradual slope. I don't see Wright as like much different from that. All he did was seek inspiration and draw from that into his own personal styles.
As he grew, his writing style changed.
And
Yeah,
it's
of
beautiful
course.
and it's gorgeous to see any artist, painter, musician, poet, writer, whatever you want to say about it, to see their style change is amazing just because they're not afraid, and they're not afraid to know which direction they want to go with their sound, with their writing, with their artwork. It's just that they're not afraid to like let that out into the audience. And I feel like most of the time it does come after the point where somebody is established in that art form. But I really feel like it's a nice gradient to see that somebody has grown in their artwork throughout time.
Yeah, you're right with the Beatles. Like, I love looking just at their discography,
Yeah.
and going through the different eras of the Beatles,
Yeah.
seeing like what they're trying, the new instruments they learn.
Exactly. You could see like the India influences.
Right,
like,
when he learned the sitar.
Sitar, yeah.
He went for like a year, right? And
George Harrison,
Yeah.
he did. It was great. Anyway, his concerns as an artist resided within native landscape. He really dealt with bodies of water a lot, which is something that I find very interesting. And
they're so powerful.
yeah, it's a very powerful motif.
It's a force of nature.
It's a force of nature. Water is a like strong force of nature. It's just like something that is unrelenting. And it flows. It takes up the shape of where it resides. It's a very beautiful, very fluid, if you will. I have no pun intended. Very fluid thing, and it's just it's a very powerful motif in my opinion for like just like. If we will relate it to his style and his genre as a poet, it does really showcase his like fluidity.
I think the interesting thing about water is the duality of it, because in a sense it's so peaceful, it's so calm. Like, imagine just this like, pure day on the lake in the morning, with flat water, no wind, maybe some birds chirping and some ducks, and then it's the most peaceful, beautiful thing that there can be. And then you have the flip side of the coin, which is tsunamis and rivers and hurricanes, in which water is destructive and so powerful and
100%.
unstoppable.
It's a peaceful and destructive force, and we've seen it all over the world of it like carrying both of those loads. Because I don't even know. I mean, like you see water being used as such a motif in music and art all the time. It's kind of hard to ignore. But anyway, moving on, his career showcases like the growth of like a postmodernist aesthetic. He was a by the book kind of guy with structure in his poetry, but I feel like wildly the artwork that he makes that is reliant on like that postmodernist aesthetic that relies on formless style was a big part of his career.
Kind of like free verse.
Yeah, I think that's what you get to towards the end of his career, towards the second half of his career, and we'll see that split in these when I start talking about his volumes. So his first two volumes were The Green Wall and St. Judas, and they were reliant mainly upon like dramatic monologues from his point of view.
Sorry if I could interrupt.
Yeah.
What do you mean by volume?
Volume, it's like a group of works that he put together over time of poetries that he felt existed within a collective, and so he put them together into a volume.
Sort of his personal anthology.
Yeah, I actually think it's a great way of describing it. I don't know exactly how long they all are. I haven't read all of them. I really I consider myself a more casual poetry goer, where I would just like find a few poems that I like and read them and understand them and find the beauty in them. And I don't think I've ever found myself reading a full volume. But however, The Green Wall and St. Judas, very reliant upon dramatic monologues, verbal irony, traditional verse forms, very strict rhythms, and formal rhyme patterns. Many of his poems' protagonists were quite anti-heroic, if you will.
Oh, really?
Mental patients, prostitutes, murderers, deviants. You see it at the murderer's grave. Like he does deal with that kind of like juxtaposition of just like standing over like a murderer's grave in that poem. It's it's very stark imagery. I appreciate.
Did people like this when it came out?
I think it was okay. So like this is like a personal opinion of mine is that like critiques of poetry is very. You gotta take it with a grain of salt. It can be well received by some and not well received by others, and we can talk about this all day. It's very confusing, but like it all comes back to like how somebody reads a poem. The first time or the second time, it's still in the eye of the beholder. It's the reader that decides, and so I don't really concern myself a ton with like critiques, like professional critiques of like poetry, especially when it comes to James Wright. Or people that aren't following like a specific style all the time. It just makes it a lot easier to understand the fact that like he's writing from his own perspective, from his own art form, and like I don't think it's fair to like allow like the critiques to like get underneath my skin and cloud my understanding of the poem. And cloud my perception of it and my likeness towards it, my appreciation of it. But I find many of his poems' protagonists were like prostitutes or people that were just like you wouldn't think they're protagonists.
Not your typical protagonist.
Of course, yeah. And obviously I don't really know the word protagonist may not fit because some of these poems aren't really like, it's not like there's like a protagonist. It's like making a character arc. It's just a person that is at the centerpiece of the poem.
Right. The focal point.
Yeah, the focal point, the local. In the preface of The Green Wall, Wright said that he tried very hard to write in the mode of Frost and Edward Arlington Robinson, which is very interesting to me just to know that he did have clear influences when he was writing these first two collections and volumes, so it was very interesting to me to know that he did have a lot of influences. He appreciated the tragic way in which both these authors viewed and wrote about the world, citing their understanding of like the darker side of the American experience that signals back into the outsider perspective.
Oh, I see.
So I think that's what he was really going for.
Oh, and all those characters you're talking about, like prostitutes,
American outsiders.
They're all outsiders.
Exactly,
yeah.
And you can see. I'm sure you'll make these point connections like as we go, and just go through his little like biography and backstory of his writings. Anyway, sometimes he expresses like dissatisfaction and with his own vocation of poetry. Like he doesn't really feel like maybe he's cut out for it. But
yeah, he won a Pulitzer Prize.
Yeah, well, that was like later in his career. I feel like. Anyway, after his second volume, St. Judas, was completed, he thought it would be his last. He didn't think he was going to keep going. He said that throughout its creation, he tried to come to terms in that book with what he felt to be the truth of his own life. These are his own words, which is that of a man who wants very much to be happy, but who is not happy. So it says a lot. I think this volume said a lot about like his health and his mental health during the time, and
that's really hard to hear.
The battles with depression. And I really feel like a lot of it might come from like how he was raised and how he was brought up. I mean, like having parents that probably worked very blue collar jobs in the states of America was probably the ideal, and he was exactly living the idyllic life, Anyway, he entered a period of depression. He appreciated the tragic ways in which these authors that influenced him viewed the world. And at first, his poem style echoed like a clear-cut iambic meter and heavily utilized verbal irony. And those are all throughout the first two works. His later works, however, The Branch That Will Not Break, Shall We Gather at the River, Two Citizens, and To a Blossoming Pear Tree, which was the last one, which is honestly, I'm pretty sure it's regarded one of his most popular works of volumes. It deviated from these traditional influences and began to exhibit like hints of like surrealism and realism as well. I feel like he really tried to come into his own style by still like gathering influences from other people.
Would he contrast surrealism and realism? Or was it like the kind of dichotomy? What do you mean by that?
I think that's a good way of saying it because he did have a lot of like realism. I think the surrealism comes from his poetic style and how he was writing, which
Okay.
was mostly in this free verse form, which allowed him to like not worry about like those
The
specific
constraints
elements.
of the normal world.
And I really feel like that was a big driving force behind him in writing in like this free verse form was that like it really didn't matter. Um,
Oh.
these ideas pick up after Saint Judas, and a lot of his influencers. One of them was Robert Bly, was cited a lot. Bly had made it apparent to Wright that poetry need not follow any one structure.
Yep.
Just as a feeling doesn't follow a single sensation. You know, when you're looking out and you're understanding something,
When I'm happy, it's more than just,
you're not
oh,
happy.
I'm happy.
It's why you're happy and
Why-
how you're happy.
And what goes into that.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
And the million different
Yeah.
things that culminate to that.
Yeah, I wrote that and I felt actually really cool about writing that. I was like, oh wow, like he's like really just like this is what he was telling him. It was like you gotta like take away from the style because people aren't just experiencing your poetry by reading it. Like they're feeling it. Like they're feeling these words.
Feeling it. I like it.
So he had to. I feel like it was kind of his poetry took on a more of a 2 or 3 pronged attack, aside from just going straight on with iambic meter and verbal irony and dramatic monologues and stuff like that. And the rejection of the reliance upon iambic meter and elaborate syntax. I think, was very, very complicated in his syntax a lot of times, especially in his earlier works.
He had a lot of like dense, complex stuff, you mean?
Yeah, he did. He
Okay.
really did. He was a very, very talented writer, in my opinion, both prose and poetic. He helped set up.
It's interesting because
Yeah.
they're opposites, you know?
Yeah, exactly. He was a very, very well-written person, in my opinion.
Must be why he won the Pulitzer Prize.
Must have been. And he helped, so Bly basically helped set up Wright's new technique, which relied heavily on free verse and conversational diction with fewer and looser rhymes, which relied basically on slant rhymes and whatnot.
Okay.
So
So we moved from a very like strict, constraining form of poetry
Yeah.
to, opening up
Yeah.
and really finding like what works for him, not what works for other
I
people.
think it was really relying on his voice. I don't think he was ever writing for people per se, but I really feel like his form took a turn of a musician who was afraid maybe at one point to share the art that their followers were following them for, and so by doing this, it was kind of a rejection of that style and just being like, you know what, like I want to do something different. Like this is how I want to write, and this is how I feel like it should be done. You know, this is
He was doing him.
he was doing himself. I really, and like, who can blame the guy, because it's poetry and he's writing like it's his
Yeah.
art, so he took it the way he
And like
wanted
you said,
to.
it was cathartic for him.
Yeah.
So
But anyway, that's all I have. I'm not gonna keep talking your ear off about, and of course our listeners, I would hate to talk their ear off about this stuff all day. Garrett and I both, from our poets that we chose, decided to just, take to our more creative side, because both of us do really enjoy the writing style and poetry. So we wanted to take a little bit of inspiration from our artists today, our poets, and we wanted to write some poems of our own, and then we'll circle back at the end, and maybe we'll give you guys a prompt to take home with you guys.
yeah. All right. So I guess I'll just get into my poem. So I was trying to emulate the Emily Dickinson style. This is a short poem. It's not too long. And yeah, I guess I won't explain too much, and I'll just go ahead and read it. As the water falls atop my head, the water drops leave marks of red. As the fire burns across the fields, I'm reminded of next harvest yield.
That was very beautiful, Garrett. Very short, concise, exactly mirroring what you would say, what you had said about Dickinson's work. Obviously using the dashes, which were very prevalent.
You guys can't see that. Dickinson uses dashes a lot. It was very unconventional in the days. A lot of people would use periods, commas, normal forms of punctuation, but the dash wasn't really seen, and a lot of people judged her quite heavily for it. And I know to us, it's kind of just like a dash. What's the big deal about it? But back then, it was different. It was counterculture. It was going against these established norms that meant a lot to people.
That's very interesting to me because, I mean, it's just a dash.
It's just a dash,
It
right?
is just a dash. Like, what does that really do? Like, that is, like, counterculture. Like, when we're talking about countercultural movements, like, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? Like, not using a dash in poetry. Like,
No, and I think this all stems back to Emily Dickinson was like a very judged person. She was a woman writing in a time when women didn't really write, and when they did, they used pseudonyms of men's names, and so she wasn't accepted. And this wasn't easy for her, but she still did it, and she's still one of the greatest poets.
Yeah,
of
absolutely.
our times. So if I'm gonna talk a little bit about this poem, it's short, it's concise, and that's a lot of what Emily Dickinson does. Is she says a lot in not a lot of words, and
Very beautiful.
I was trying to be really careful with which word I put in there.
Deliberate.
Because when you have exactly. When you have so limited of a space in like the haiku format, for example, each word really means something, and I feel like that's something that Dickinson does so well. That each one of her words is there for a reason.
Yeah.
And I was trying my best to replicate that. Of course, I talk about nature, the water and fire dynamic. But more importantly, this poem kind of stemmed from that lark poem I read before, in the sense that I don't think things are either beautiful or not beautiful. And I kind of wanted to highlight like the duality of that, how things aren't as black and white as we like to categorize them into being. Because we're so quick to throw labels on that as good or bad or whatever. And that's just for our own sake to be able to say like, oh, I know this, I understand this, it's sorted out in my head. Mm-hmm. But things are so much more complex, like the emotions you were talking about. There's so many sides to things. Yeah. And I wanted to highlight like the interplay between water and fire, two famously opposite elements in nature. And so I wanted to say like, yeah, water's beautiful and it flows and it falls and it's great, but it can also hurt, kind of like James Wright. Yeah. And I also wanted to say, yeah, fire is like consuming and hot and painful and raging, but it also can bring life and it flows. Yeah. And there's beauty to each thing. I really just wanted to highlight, Justin, that things are multifaceted. There's more to it than the labels that we prescribe to it. And I think we're so quick to forget that. Yeah. And like it's hard to see that through the words sometimes, and like, you know what, it really takes like a patient mind to actively decipher a poem, especially one that is shorter sometimes. And isn't that surprising to think that the shorter poems might take a little bit time to, get acquainted with, just because we've had this conversation about haikus before, where we're just like, haikus, like, they're so short, like, how are you supposed to get something out of them? Yeah. And like, so like, maybe it just takes a little bit of more patience to really understand the world that this small poem is existing within. Aside from that, the contrast is stark. The contrast is there, and it's very well understood. With the fire thing, just to throw it out there, I remember this one episode of Avatar: The Last Airbender. Man goes out into the field. The forest is burnt to a crisp. The spirit of the forest hands him an acorn. Knows the forest is going to come back after being burned down. Fire is a beautiful thing that, like we were talking about before. Water is a destructive force just as much as it is a beautiful fluid thing that is always in motion, always fluid, always moving. Just like fire, it's something that can bring great destruction and also great beauty. So it's very, very gorgeous. Thank you. Yeah. Do you want to go into your poem now? Yeah. So I'm gonna just go into this, and I'll read it first, and then we can gab about it after. Great. Within the sun's reach is a swift drop into a boundless mosaic of color. As a subtle breeze meandered through, we reach out to the everlasting expanse of day, holding on to each passing visual sensation without illustration. Lost for words, laconic, not purposefully, yet beautifully. How can we be this small? I wish I knew. We connect over what is known about ourselves. Our existential prattle rambles just the same as the rivers, running parallel to one another, unaware we are swimming in circles.
So yeah, I mean, like when I was reading, when I was like writing this, and when I was like trying to exemplify and find ways to like shadow his James Wright's work,
Yeah.
the first thing that came to mind was that I really wanted to write something in free verse, and maybe free
Yeah.
verse isn't like the perfect way to like make an example of somebody's writing because it's just a hard thing to replicate, just because free verse is in essence free and
Yeah.
just like it is what it is, and it's very literal. It's
And
just
broadly defined.
broadly
varying
defined.
in range.
How are you supposed to copy somebody who has copy something that has no structure, no form, and it's just like how you want it to be, like straight off the bat. But like honestly, that's what guided me through this. And it's, in addition to that, the motif of water in this work,
Yeah.
a lot of the time in the bodies of water was something that drove me forward in understanding that like, and aside from that, just like the thoughts of like like existentialism and like just like random prattle like really like pushed my ideas forward, that like about like being an outsider and talking about like what is known about us and not as what known about like every other person in the world. I really just wanted to like make it known that like it's okay to like have these thoughts and like to have these questions about yourself and what's going on around you, and that just in the end of the day, like we are just kind of like swimming through life in an uphill stream, and like sometimes even life like swims in circles, and that was kind of the idea I was trying to get at, that life rambles just like a river does.
Yeah,
And,
this is beautiful, Justin. I totally see the elements of Wright, especially in that whole sense of like that longing to like. I felt like when you read the poem, it was almost like reaching out to me,
Yeah.
or almost more like I was reaching out to something.
Yeah.
And I think you really did a good job of that in that little dialogue clip you had. That was
Yeah.
like, what was it? How can we be this small? I wish I knew.
Yeah, because it was like the idea was just like we were taught like we're like these two, maybe it's two people, maybe it's a group of people. I can't really say because it was really just like based off of whatever experience. It was just kind of like what came to heart.
Right.
And it's just like a very small dialogue just to like exemplify like a little bit of scale. Is just like how can we be this small? It's pretty ambiguous, but like it's a big thought. It's
It is a
small
big
dialogue, big thought, and it's just like, because that thought could go for miles. Like they could run, you could take that and run whichever way you want with it.
But I like the ambiguity to it.
Yeah.
I think that makes it more encompassing of what it really means to be small. And I think the ambiguity, because it's so like broad, kind of makes me feel even smaller. It gives me that like awareness that like we are just this cog in the machine that is life. You know?
Of course. And like you can take it however which way you want. Like this poem wasn't meant to be like some like existential like masterpiece where it's like people are looking at it and they're like mind blown. Like
I'm kind of having a quarter life crisis.
yeah,
right
like
now.
I'm having an existential crisis. Like now I don't even know what to do with my life. I might as well just go write poetry for the rest of my life like Emily Dickinson did in her house. Might as well just never see the light of day again. However, the idea was really just to like pose a question for the reader to interpret on their own, and of course you guys can our listeners can take it however they want both of our poems, and that just like knowing that like especially in free verses, that like I feel like when you're stripped of the scansion, when you're stripped of the meter and you're stripped of that level of meaning, you have to find meaning in the words, in the dialogue. And
I think in that in-between space that can't be captured by words.
No.
That gets you to the right location, but can't tell you what it is,
It's very, very complicated, and that's why I love poetry so much. I think it's a great thing.
Yeah, we could make this podcast 5 hours.
Yeah, we can make this podcast 5 hours, of course.
But
anyway.
we won't, and I think that's a good closing point.
Yeah, so we'll close up now. I think a good thing that we would do, honestly, I'm gonna throw one out there just for our listeners, just to be like, I think one poem, if I were to recommend one by James Wright, is Autumn Begins in Martins Ferry, Ohio. This is one that I just wanted to recommend to you guys, just so you guys can take something away from this talk and this chat. I know that me and Garrett can be a little bit, we can ramble on for a while, and maybe we don't give you guys enough time to think or talk.
We'd love to hear what you guys have to say.
Yeah, please.
So please contact us.
Garrett, would you like to
Yeah,
give a
yeah. I actually
recommendation?
have a poem as well by Emily Dickinson that I'd like to recommend. It's called "Hope is a Thing with Feathers," and it's a pretty cliche one. It's a classic Emily Dickinson one, but it touches me. I don't want to spoil it, and I don't want to like put my impression on it, but it meant a lot to me when I read it, and I think you guys will enjoy it as well.
I would like to leave the listeners with their own little creative project for themselves,
Right.
Just because, like, I'm sure a lot of the listeners that we have are really enjoying poetry right now, and I feel like just, like, writing poetry is a great way to keep that interest going. So I think, we're wrapping up the end of our sophomore year right now at Skidmore College, and I think just, a prompt, like a poem that you could write about it, throw it in free verse, throw it in iambic pentameter, it doesn't
Whatever you
matter.
like.
Whatever you like, this is completely up to you. But you know what, just, I would like you to reflect a little bit on, if you're in college, if you're in grade school, just to reflect on the past year and how introspective it's been for you and your family through the coronavirus pandemic, and it's been a tough time for everybody. And coming out of it, coming at the butt out of it now, I think it's an important thing to get a little bit of closure about and catharsis. And I think this is a great way. Writing a poem about it. However you want to do it, you are not going to be great on it. Do not worry. Read it to your family, read it to your friends. Take your time, and most importantly, have fun.
Have fun with it.
Anyway, so
Thank you for tuning in.
I'm Justin,
I'm Garrett,
and this is
Poems by
People. Thank you.